Hello, everybody, and welcome to Deep Macro's Future Finance Podcast. My name is Jeffrey Young, and I'm the CEO of Deep Macro. And today I have with me Dr. Tomohiko Taniguchi. Dr. Taniguchi was the primary foreign policy speechwriter for Prime Minister Shinzo Abe from January 2013 until September 2020. He was also the speechwriter for both Prime Minister Abe and Foreign Minister Aso during Abe's previous term in office. He's super well plugged into Japanese politics, and we have him here to talk about the ruling Liberal Democratic Party's presidential election, which is later this month, how it might affect Japan and Japan's relations with the rest of the world. Currently, he's the special advisor at the Fujitsu Future Studies Centre and a specially appointed professor at Tsukuba University. We are really, really lucky to have him here, as he's always very, very busy, including with many media appearances. So anyway, Dr. Taniguchi, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff.
And I wanted to start really simply with the procedures because the LDP is having what it calls its presidential election this month. Can you go over the basic mechanics of the system, what's at stake for people who might not know the ins and outs of Japanese politics as you do?
Once every 3 years, the ruling party, the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, selects its leader. So it's been long on the schedule for the LDP. Prime Minister Kishida was supposed to be able to carry on as president of the LDP because it was seen that it would be easier for him to win the contest scheduled this month. Nonetheless, he stepped down. He chose to step down. The election is due on the 26th of September this month, and currently Japanese parliamentarians number 713 for both houses, lower and upper houses. Out of 713, 367 are the members of the LDP. Each one of those 367 parliamentarians does have her vote to cast on the 26th September. In addition to that, you get tens and thousands of members, rank and file grassroots members of the LDP. They cast their votes, but using something called don't method, or in the United States, I have learned that you call it Jefferson method as well. But anyhow, the big number cast by the members of the LDP will be boiled down by dividing those numbers by numbers such as 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then votes will be distributed by the order of the size of the number to each one of those contenders of the presidential race for the LDP. Once chosen as president of the LDP, because the LDP has as many seats as 367 out of 713, it is automatic that the lower house to be assembled sometime in October will nominate the Japanese prime minister.
Okay.
Theoretically speaking, the Japanese prime minister has to be endorsed by the emperor, but that's the procedure.
I see. So it'll be over within a month is kind of one of the things you're saying. The election itself will be done on the 26th. Is that correct?
Yes, it's correct.
Okay, so compared to our system here, I'm in New York. It's pretty quick. It's pretty efficient. Yeah. Does the public feel that it has a lot of input into this process?
I think it's one of the races that's been most interesting in many respects. Number one, Prime Minister Kishida's decision was made in a hasty manner without him being viewed as a safe candidate. So that's number one. Number two, you have as many as 9 contenders for one single post of the president of the LDP. Before, the country had as many as 5 contenders, but that was the biggest number. And this year, you get 9. One of them is pretty young. 2 of them are pretty young in their 40s, and 2 of them are also female candidates. And a couple of the rest are sort of old guards. You get a colorful combination of contenders. And although it's, may I say, family affairs, not a public affairs, but family affairs, because it is strictly within the party, nonetheless, it makes lots of headlines. It makes lots of newswide shows, and it's been talked about for some time, and it'll be talked about even more going forward until the 26th.
Yeah, I was actually in Japan last week, and the daily newspapers, the afternoon what do I want to call them? Sort of more like the gossip sheets, the TV. It is all over the place, and I think it's really kind of extraordinary. What about the relationship or the relative balance between the LDP members in the parliament and the party members in the general public? Often, at least in the markets, people think it's all very much an internal party affair. Maybe the party member vote is just for show. Would you say that that's changing, and that possibly it becomes more important for the winning candidate, to be generally popular among the public?
She does not have to be popular in the general public, but they are keenly aware elections are due for both houses. And even within this year, the election for the lower house may take place. So the strong candidate to be chosen as president of the LDP must be someone who could lead the pack, and who could lead the pack to victory in the upcoming elections. So in order for her to be the face of the party, she has to be very much popular, well recognized, and well known to the public. And Japanese LDP's members reflect the sentiment and views and the opinions more or less held by the general public. So although it is a party family affair, it nonetheless reflects the general prevailing tendency.
Right. And you mentioned that there could be a lower house election even this year. So this will be done September 26th. The formality is in October, but we could even have an election this year.
Yes.
Okay.
The rumor holds that the 1st of October, there will be the lower house is going to be convened. And on that day, or the second day of the lower house session, the newly elected Prime Minister may likely dissolve the lower house, and then snap elections will follow.
I see. Okay. Let's shift a little bit then to these candidates. You mentioned that there are 9. Who would you say would be the top 3? And obviously, this is your own opinion or what the general mood thinks. Who would you say are the ones we should really be looking at?
Many media outlets are asking members of the LDP about who they would like to elect. And the topmost candidate, generally favored by the members of the LDP, is someone called Shigeru Ishiba or Shinjiro Koizumi, depending on which poll you're talking about. Shigeru Ishiba is the eldest member of the contenders, and he has failed a number of times, may I say, for the presidential elections of the LDP. And another candidate, Shinjiro Koizumi, as the name suggests, is a son to the former Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi, who was very much close to George W. Bush, is also very much popular. And Shinjiro Koizumi, interestingly, when he laid out his policy platforms mentioned that I, if elected, would dissolve the Japanese lower house immediately because he is aware that he's a very good campaigner. The third is Sanae Takaichi. Takaichi, family name, Sanae, given name. And she is also popular, especially among the LDP members. She is right of center, Ishiba center, and Shinjiro Koizumi, if you look at the spectrum within the party, will probably a little left of center. So that's the sort of profile you're looking at. Dark horse, if you like, is someone called Mr. Kobayashi, Takayuki Kobayashi, who is in his 40s, relatively young, and who's been backed by relatively new members of the LDP parliamentarians. So he represents the newness of the party. So there are some others. Some of them are very much well known, but I'll stop here because
Okay, yeah, no, there's nine. Yes,
all right.
well, that's going to be fun to see who gets it. But you mentioned that for example, Ms. Takaichi is to the right of center, and Mr. Koizumi is probably a little bit to the left of center. What are I mean, in the Japanese context, what does right and left really mean? Here, I think we have a pretty good understanding of who's left and who's right, although you could also argue that that has been really jumbled in recent years. But tell us a little bit, what does right wing mean in Japan?
I might have confused the audience. In the Japanese context, the right is about being hawkish.
Okay.
In terms of national security and in terms of resisting finance ministry groupthink. You get groupthink of finance ministry. Financial frugality is the most important thing. And the right that I mentioned means that people are more pro-growth and less interested in fiscal situation. But broadly speaking, the right is about national security, hawks, and resisting finance ministry groupthink, and left means slightly less interested in national security. By the way, if you think about national security, it means almost always what sort of attitudes would you have vis-a-vis China? So national security starts from China and ends with China. So that's where Japan is. Left people are more about European sense of social democrats, and that's about the leftists in Japan. And when it comes to U.S.-Japan security alliance, there is a gradation. Certainly, the rightist people are more in favor of the U.S.-Japan alliance. And when it comes to the left of center, some of them are very much uneasy about continuing to ally with the United States. But compared to 20, 30 years ago, may I say that there is a broader consensus in a bipartisan fashion when it comes to the importance of maintaining the military alliance with the United States in good order.
Okay. Great, thank you. Maybe this relates a little bit to Prime Minister Abe's legacy. He was in office for a very long time, and he left a mark in a way that most Japanese prime ministers don't, because obviously they tend to rotate pretty quickly, and you've referred to the influence of the bureaucracy. Obviously ended in tragedy, and which was very shocking to everybody. Tell us a little bit about what you think the legacy of Prime Minister Abe was. Is his print on what is left, what is right, uh, increasing the bipartisan agreement about certain things on foreign policy, or was his term in office just an exception, and we're going back to the old LDP of rotating prime ministers and factional politics?
If you look at where Japan is, geographically speaking, it's not the kind of neighborhood you could envy. You get Russia, North Korea, China, none of which has ever practiced anything akin to open democracy, and each one of those countries is busy building nuclear arsenal. North Korea is one such example, but Chinese military is increasing both nuclear warheads and missiles and so on. So it's one of the precarious, very much precarious environments you can think about. Given this, Shinzo Abe tried to broaden Japan's strategic space by doing a lot in bringing Japan to like-minded seafaring maritime democracies. The salience of the United States should go without saying, but the Australian-Japanese relationship has never been as close as it is now. It is one of the achievements that Shinzo Abe has done. And there was a reluctance on the part of the Indian policy circle to make India closer to the English-speaking world for an understandable reason. But Shinzo Abe worked hard to bring Japan closer to India and bring India closer to the trilateral relationship of the United States, Japan, and Australia. By so doing, he tried to widen the Japanese horizon, diplomatic horizon. And also, he took an enormous amount of effort by consuming a lot of his political capital and made it possible for the first time for Japanese armed forces to work closely as a unit with the U.S. armed forces. You might have been very much surprised, but there was no such arrangement prior to that. So if you think about it, supposing U.S. naval ship is navigating in the public sea, let's say in the Western Pacific, all of a sudden finds itself being attacked by the third party, the Japanese naval boat, even if it is navigating close by, could not have done anything without consulting first with the Tokyo's political government. Now it is automatic because the presence of the U.S. Armed Forces is closely interlinked and connected with Japan's own national security. It's called collective self-defense. And because of this anti-military sentiment that was embedded very much deeply within the in the Japanese political psyche, collective psyche, it was not possible, but Shinzo Abe made it possible. So from the Chinese standpoint, if you can imagine, you must always think about the United States military presence and the Japanese armed forces as a combined unit. It's given a huge boost in the deterrence capacities of the U.S.-Japan alliance vis-a-vis China. So that's another one that Shinzo Abe made.
And would you say, if I may, would you say that's a fairly permanent, kind of regardless of the left wing, the right wing, whoever gets it, this is going to continue?
Yes, it's engraved into the law.
Right.
And so
Okay.
unless you think of abolishing the law, it's going to continue. Now, domestically speaking, he proposed what was called Abenomics. And although it failed to bring the huge amount of dormant money, cash, and deposits from Japanese non-banking corporate sector to the marketplace, but the job number has improved dramatically. At one point, 98 out of 100 job-seeking graduates of both high school and college found decent job opportunities. So employment figure has improved very much, and he started to address one of the most fundamental issues, namely to rewrite Japan's social contract. What does it mean? The Japanese elderly citizens get lion's share of Japanese welfare provision, and so much so that there is a sense among the young that over time there would be no amount of money available for them once they get old. Let me just give you a number. Japanese fiscal budget, let's say federal budget, is as big in terms of number as the GDP of Turkey or Saudi Arabia. It fluctuates along with the foreign exchange rate, but it's a big number. But out of that big Japanese national budget, federal budget, 70% is fixed. Japanese social welfare spending is large, and Japanese government bond obligations large, and the Tokyo central government is distributing taxpayers' money to municipal governments, municipal administrations, and you cannot reduce that money either. So combined, these three elements, only three elements, make up 70% of the Japanese budget. And whatever you talk about, increasing your defense spending, increasing the spending for basic science research, increasing the salaries for armed forces or police or firefighters, you must grow. And how could you grow was something that finance ministry did not think about. You may be amazed, but it's customary for finance ministry to think about tax incomes and distribution of the tax incomes, but there was no sense of dynamic growth within the finance ministry. So that made Shinzo Abe very much uneasy. So he and his administration, for the first time in post-war history, dominated the process of policy formulations, either about fiscal policy or about growth policy. And there was a centrality you can find within the Japanese Prime Minister's office. But it was not actually Shinzo Abe's sole achievement. It's a result of the long continued process of centralizing the decision-making process, which previously had been scattering around across the Japanese central ministries. So bureaucrats were the policy formers and drivers, but now it is the Prime Minister's office that's been laying out fundamental policies, either budgetary policy or spending policy, and so on.
Okay, interesting. So that's a good transition. I did want to ask about a couple other issues that are very important to investors. You've already touched upon several of them, but I'm just wondering if the candidates have very sharp views or differences of opinion. Starting with growth, as you mentioned, I think the way you described it was Prime Minister Abe was focused on increasing the size of the pie rather than just the distribution, the cutting the slices up, yeah, he is well known for Abenomics, which had basically the three arrows of monetary, fiscal, and structural reform. On the monetary and fiscal side, Japan implemented extraordinary support, a lot of innovation that was later copied by other countries on the monetary side. Japan has had inflation that's above the target for a couple of years now, and that's been a surprise to some people, including myself. The Bank of Japan has exited the extraordinary policies and it's begun to raise interest rates. Do you think it's going to be okay for the Bank of Japan to keep raising rates? At least, is that a politically controversial policy, or will most of the LDP just say the Bank of Japan is independent, let them do what they want?
Mr. Ueda, the current governor of Central Bank of Japan, I think is still in his learning process of how best to communicate with the marketplace. Kuroda, his predecessor, was very much interested in disseminating information and speaking with the marketplace. But Ueda has hinted rather in a hasty fashion that it is a done deal for the central bank to continue to raise interest rates. And that, excuse me, invited repercussion. But strikingly, there has been very little opposition voiced by the politicians, either from the ruling party coalition or the opposition party, about the way in which the monetary policy is being conducted by Governor Ueda. So conventional wisdom holds now that it is not a question of whether or not he is going to raise the interest rates further, but how soon he is going to raise the interest rates. What he is indicating, if I understand correctly, to the markets is now that yes, Central Bank of Japan is going to raise the interest rates, but do so in a gradual way, in a cautious way, looking at what's going on in the marketplace, especially the enormous effect of carry trade unwinding has given a huge volatility to the Japanese foreign exchange market, as is well known to you among your audiences. So that's what the situation is looking like. When it comes to inflation, yes, inflation is an important issue, especially for the elderly citizens dependent on the fixed amount of pension incomes. But compared to other nations, for instance, the UK and so on, core inflation Japan has is relatively mild, and there aren't so many people crying out loud that you must do this now before it's too late to the Japanese government to help fill the gap between their incomes and the inflation burden, if you like. So I'm giving you just a roundabout explanation, but fiscal policy, monetary policy is one issue that neither one of those 9 presidential contenders has spoken about.
I see. And okay, and the inflation, has certainly become a big political issue in the U.S. It's one of the major reasons why, if you look at public opinion polls, what people think about the economy, they're still sort of sour on the economy, even though in the U.S. unemployment is very low, wage growth has been good, stock market's high, all that kind of stuff. It seems like we've come to the point where low inflation was public enemy number one in many countries before the pandemic, but we rather quickly, at least here, went the other way. And so it's interesting to hear that in Japan, you say that there's some dissatisfaction, but it hasn't really bubbled up into a political issue. Would you, is that basically what you would say?
Yes, that's how I view the situation, especially certainly that the Japanese government under Prime Minister Kishida has had to spend a huge amount of money to help stabilize the prices for basic fundamental materials like petrol or gas and some of the basic food materials. But the public, let's say, uneasiness about inflation is, I think, under more or less managed control.
Right. Okay. And related to that, one of the things that affects inflation is the yen value. As the yen was weakening toward 160 yen to the dollar, that was pushing up prices of everything that was imported. Energy was also, the base dollar price was going up. So kind of a double whammy there. We've corrected. I think that right now I should check I haven't checked the market today, but about 142. How is that level viewed? Is that viewed still as weak, that the import costs are going to be too high? Um, or does anybody think that it's too strong and that Japan still has some deflationary tendencies and it would be better to kind of keep up a very, very loose policy?
I am not a professional expert in terms of financial.
Politically, I just, what is it just a non-issue? Sometimes it becomes very important because everybody can see it every day. It moves, and
Let me tell you a couple of things. The foreign exchange rate, the change therein, has lowered the international ranking as regards GDP of Japan from the third place to the fourth. So that's an eye-opening. That was an eye-opening event for many. And at 160 versus $1, the Japanese, everything in Japan became so cheap. And if you come to Japan, you will see a huge number of tourists from all corners of the world. And unlike before, some of them were apparently from low income bracket of their societies. So Japan is bargain sale now. And 160 yen as opposed to $1 was in that sense too cheap. And that's what the general public viewed about the level of the Japanese currency. But 130, 140, I think that's an okay level for both exporters and importers. Exporters include such companies and Toyota and so on. And import prices do matter. As I mentioned, the price hike of petrol was at one time a serious issue. So yes, did I answer your question?
yeah, no, that's perfect. And obviously, you're right. Things are cheap from a dollar perspective. You're right also about the diversity of the tourism. It's not just a few countries in Asia and North America. It really is global. And it does kind of go to lower strata. The Economist magazine calculates the Big Mac index that shows the exchange rate that would equalize the price of a Big Mac across different countries.
Yeah.
I calculated what I call a big ramen index
Mm.
between the US and Japan, because Ichiran ramen you can get in New York. My calculation was 40, which would imply that the yen was about 75 to 80% undervalued. So it's a very cheap, even with the adjustment to the low 140s, I think it still seems to be very cheap as a consumer, even though not as cheap as it was at 160. It's still good value. But
Mm.
another thing related to that, you mentioned tourism, but what about immigration, which would be permanent, or let's say semi-permanent or temporary, but easy to renew if you leave the country for a couple days, maybe go to, it's only an hour flight to Seoul. Um, what is the debate about immigration? Because again, I lived in Japan, left 20 years ago, and I think there's just been a huge change. Of all the things about the Japanese social contract that you mentioned, it had been assumed that Japan would just never accept immigration, but that looks like it's very much worn down. How does that play politically? And especially, do people see it as a help to raise Japan's long-term growth prospects?
That's one of the deepest fault lines you can see in Japanese politics. it's not surfaced much in this presidential race process for the ruling party LDP, but it's been one of the most talked about issues. Immigration for Japan is all about Chinese. Believe me, you have 3.1 million registered foreigners, legal foreigners, out of which 25% have come from mainland China. So that distinguishes the immigration issue in Japan from those in the United States, in Europe, UK, and so on. Given the proximity between China and Japan, the tendency is going to be the same for many, many years to come. Coupled with the cheap value of the Japanese currency, you can naturally assume that the massive amount of money from Chinese rich people is coming to Japan to buy critical assets, including land property that is geographically close to some of the sensitive Japanese assets, namely military bases and so on and so forth. And also, psychologically speaking, it is as if Japan is undergoing an increased shadow of Chinese influence because most of the graduate schools cannot make both ends meet without accepting and embracing more and even more Chinese students. And that's been accelerated by the fact that it's become harder still for the Chinese students to find schools in Australia, in the United States, in the UK. So there's been an increase of Chinese students coming to Japan for higher education. Now, if China is an open democratic system, it's totally okay. But you must assume that out of that huge number of Chinese citizens coming to Japan, many may be associated with the Chinese Communist Party. And if you have two more members of the Chinese Communist Party, in addition to you as a party member, you must, by the Chinese Party's constitution, build a fundamental organization, which used to be called cell in the Cold War terms, and establish a report line with the Chinese Communist Party. So that sets the immigration situation in Japan apart from the rest of the world. And sooner rather than later, this is going to be some of those very much seriously, hotly debated issues. So far, it's not surfaced as much. What's been talked about, especially in the SNS community, is this disproportionate concentration of Kurdish people in one commuter town very close to Tokyo. And they disobey almost all rules and regulations. That's what people are concerned about. And the police force is very weak against those people. In a very small way, you could say what's happening in Japan is a reflection of what's happened, let's say, in the UK of late. And if this reflects a fundamental tendency, you must be concerned about what's going to happen in 10 years' time. Now, coming back to whether or not Japan has started to accept immigrants, it certainly is the case that Japanese have opened its door much widely to the people from abroad. Obtaining Japanese version of green card, that is to say, permanent residency visa, is, may I say, much, much easier than is the case with the United States. A friend of mine is in the process of obtaining green card in the United States, and he always gives me how difficult it is for him to get one green card in the United States. And I've been comparing the procedure with that in in Japan. So if you seek a green card, that's very easy. And many of the foreigners are working here with a visa which allows her to stay in Japan for 5, 6, or fixed period of time. But once in Japan, many of them may have families by marrying Japanese partners and so on. And once you settled in Japan as a member of the family, all of a sudden everything else gets much easier.
I see.
So obtaining permanent residency visa, obtaining Japanese passport would become very much easy.
Mhm.
And that's been part of the issues that people in the SNS sphere are talking about it, because there is no screening process. You don't have to remember Japanese national anthem. You don't have to remember the Japanese names of states, if you like, prefectures, and you don't have to say who is Japanese Prime Minister now. So there is no screening process, and obtaining Japanese national passport is much easier than you might think.
Okay. Interesting. So I wanted to conclude to come back to where we started on the presidential election. Give me your best shot. Who do you think is most likely to win?
Well, it's really hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard. I wish I had a crystal ball, but Shigeru Ishiba, the eldest candidate, versus Shinjiro Koizumi,
hmm
who is relatively, in Japanese standard, good looking, which is important to win votes from the general public. And he is a very good one-liner, as
hmm
was the case with his father.
hmm
So he's a good campaigner.
hmm
It's been evinced that he has been very good in campaigning. So it's one of the uh, prognosis, if you like, about what's going to happen in the race. Close by, the third candidate would be either Sanae Takaichi or Takayuki Kobayashi.
hmm
Um, that's as much as what I can say at the moment.
Okay, we'll have to wait. Okay, but at least it's not a very long wait. It'll all be done by September 26th. So
Yes,
we'll know in about 2 weeks. Okay,
right.
excellent. Yes. Well, thank you so much. It's really been great to chat. A lot of interesting stuff here. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
The content is for informational purposes only. You should not construe any such information or other material as legal, tax, investment, financial, or other advice. Nothing contained in this material constitutes a solicitation, recommendation, endorsement, or offer by Deep Macro Incorporated or any third-party service provider to buy or sell any securities or other financial instruments in this or in any other jurisdiction in which such solicitation or offer would be unlawful under the securities laws of such jurisdiction. All content is information of a general nature and does not address the circumstances of any particular individual or entity. None of the information constitutes professional and/or financial advice, nor does any of the information constitute a comprehensive or complete statement of the matters discussed or the law relating thereto. There are risks associated with investing. Loss of principal is possible. Some high-risk investments may use leverage, which will accentuate gains and losses of securities or firms' past investment performance is not a guarantee or predictor of future investment performance.